Okay, here's our question on the Convention of Individual Ministerial Responsibility being no longer relevant in modern government. It's a 25-mark question. The way I handle this is I'll go through the classic template of talking through an introduction, 3 key points, for and against to give us balance, and then a conclusion. So, we're talking about the Convention of Individual Ministerial Responsibility. So what's a convention? Remember that it's an unwritten part of our Constitution. It says that essentially the ministers should be accountable for the actions of their department, and we should have ministerial resignation if there's any failures in policy. Theakston reinforces this with his formal constitutional model because the minister is the elected member and therefore they should be accountable to Parliament. But what we're doing in our debate is we're talking about the fact that there's been a recent reluctance of ministers to take responsibility for their actions and an increasing complexity in government decisions, which possibly makes the convention less realistic in modern times. Now, in terms of the examples that you want to think about, there's loads in terms of whether or not ministers have or haven't resigned over time. You have Patel there resigning from the International Development Ministry, as against Chris Grayling's reluctance to resign over the Brexit ferry fiasco. If you go back in time, Estelle Morris being willing to resign over education policy, and you can always compare that to our President Gavin Williamson. So how do you look at this question? Well, there's a number of points you would want to raise. If we look at them as we put them on the screen here, there are ways in which you can challenge the question. The statement says it's no longer relevant, but it is. It's a constitutional expectation. It's important because it supports civil servants in their principles of being anonymous. And thirdly, it is more important probably now because they're using special advisors, ministers, and therefore they need to be responsible for those particular people within their department. However, the challenge to this is to say that they're ignoring the convention. Civil servants are increasingly publicly criticised. And actually, decision-making, in essence, is very, very complicated. And this will be the basis of our essay discussion. So let's take the first one, the first point. The convention remains relevant due to its constitutional importance. Well, as we've said before, Theakston has outlined this in his formal constitutional model. The civil servant is subservient to the minister. He's the elected member of Parliament, therefore should be accountable for the decisions that are made. And there's some good examples of how this has been there in the past. Dugdale in the 1950s over the Critchell Down affair, Carrington as Foreign Secretary during the Falklands, and then, as I was saying before, Estelle Morris as Education Secretary under Blair. However, the relevance of this convention has been challenged because ministers are increasingly ignoring the convention. And it is unwritten, so it can't be enforced by Parliament. So you could look at Ian Duncan Smith over universal credit, and as I've said about Chris Grayling over the preparations for Brexit, to show that in fact the convention can be ignored by ministers in particular circumstances. Perhaps in our evaluation we're considering the relevance of the Prime Minister here. If the Prime Minister gives support to the ministers can get round this particular convention. If support is withdrawn, the minister is in a position where resignation is more likely. Second point, the convention remains relevant as civil servants need to remain anonymous in government. It's one of the key principles that the civil service are highly reliant on the fact that the convention will keep them anonymous from interest groups in the public, allowing them to give frank advice. If that was taken away, the civil servants would be pretty much undermined and unable to remain as permanent fixtures within government who are impartial. There are arguments against this, though, to say that in reality, the modern communication age means that civil servants are very difficult. Their anonymity is very difficult to protect. Riddle put this forward in his report on the civil service, saying that that civil servants now testify in the select committees, and ministers' willingness to criticise publicly civil servants such as Derek Lewis under Michael Howard does show that in fact the convention is under strain. Francis Maud, when he was at the Cabinet Office as a minister, also said that he preferred civil servants to be much more accountable, suggesting the convention is under political pressure. There is certainly an evaluation where you would talk about the strain that the convention is under, whether it can remain realistic in the modern age, where that tension between ministers and civil servants is much more public. The Convention remains important, this is our third point, despite the complex nature of decision making. It is pretty important, I think, in this particular discussion to talk about special advisors and the emergence of special advisors and how they support, reinforce the minister, but also need to be held accountable for the actions that they're taking. So because of the Convention, you could say it's been further reinforced by the fact that ministers must take responsibility for the advice that they're given. Dominic Cummings' education with Michael Gove, Ed Balls as advisor to Gordon Brown at the Treasury are good examples of strong ministers with special advisors who had to be responsible for the policies that they're making. However, the balance of this particular point would be that actually the ministers have got a wide range of influences upon them, and it's too simplistic probably to say that the policy is made by the minister. Constitutional reforms in recent times have made policymaking much more diverse, such as devolution, the constraints of the Human Rights Act. You could talk about international agreements in particular ways, all of which constrain a minister. So the simplicity of saying the minister is responsible is perhaps difficult to sustain in a political system which has evolved in the decision making of ministers in civil service in Whitehall. So how do we conclude? Well, you're going to have to make a judgment. Is the Convention still relevant? If you're arguing that it's no longer relevant, you'd have to accept the fact that the elected minister is still important as being accountable to Parliament. However, you'd probably stress the fact that the Convention does not reflect the practical reality of how decisions are made in modern times and the modern willingness of ministers not to follow its requirements. If you're arguing that it's still relevant, you'd have to acknowledge the fact that it's been under significant pressure. The complexity of decision making in government means that it actually isn't a reflection of day-to-day practice. However, you would be stressing the fact that it continues to provide a baseline for accountability in government, essential to parliamentary oversight in an age of very complex government decision making. Okay, good luck.